Okay, it's officially 1:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon and good evening to our panelists who are joining us from Ireland, and welcome to our Meet the Makers event for Keep It a Secret, which kicks off season 6 of Doc World. And for those of you joining us who aren't familiar, Doc World is world's showcase for exceptional documentaries sourced from around the globe. My name is Devin Karambelas. I'm the Senior Programming Manager at GBH and World, as well as a super fan of this film, as my colleagues in Boston could tell you. In 1972, at the height of the Troubles, every international sporting event in Ireland was canceled except for one, the Eurosurf Championship, the largest surfing event in Europe and the contest that would put Irish surfing on the map for better or worse. Keep It a Secret tells the unsung history of the early pioneers of Irish surfing who were able to find common ground and a passion for riding waves, even amid political hostilities and sectarian violence. And this is a momentous week, of course, for us to be premiering this documentary on American public television and hosting this conversation. As some of you may know, April 10th marked the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. This is a total gem of a film. It's anchored by fantastic, emotional, often irreverent interviews with the crew that you wish you could surf with, or at least grab a pint with. And I'm really thrilled that a few of them can join us today for this conversation. A quick housekeeping note, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them as many as we can throughout the discussion, and we will save time at the end for Q&A as well. So I'm going to start by showing the trailer to kind of prime the pump, and then we'll get into introductions and get the conversation going. So Colin, could we please roll the trailer?
In the 1960s, surfing became a worldwide phenomenon.
For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the ocean and riding waves.
All that surfers crave are big waves and small crowds.
How many days I showed up at Bundoran, which is, in my mind, it was a wave as good as any wave I'd surfed anywhere in the world. And if there was somebody there, I was going to know who they were, and we were going to share waves together.
They found both in Ireland.
The ultimate secret spot.
They didn't even know that there was such fabulous waves in Ireland.
This like sense of freedom, like, where's your oyster?
Back then, once you met one or two of the Irish surfers, you were introduced into the whole surfing community, which was very small.
These were the years of violence, the Troubles in Ireland.
And the next thing, like, the ambulance started arriving, I started to realize that that bomb was actually in that building that I had just come out of, you know?
But the surfers built a community across religious and political divides.
The surfers in Ireland then, they didn't put up with any of this nonsense about North and South, Catholic and Protestant. The only distinction was drawn was in the water and how well you surfed. And we were all just surfers.
I wanted the world to know that Ireland was a surfing nation. We actually had waves as good as anybody else.
Surfing is best kept to a small community. These are our waves, this is my beach.
Should they tell the world or keep it a secret? On Doc World. Watch on World Channel and in the PBS app.
Okay, so we're going to delve into more clips, conversation, some crack. Sean, Kevin, Davy, Dr. Cronin, or Mike, as you said, you'd prefer to be called. I will address you, but again, I want this to be a conversation and informal as much as we can on Zoom, so please don't hesitate to jump in. So now let's start with some introductions. I'm so thrilled to first welcome Sean Duggan, the director of Keep It a Secret. Hey, Sean.
Thanks.
And Davy Govan, one of the early pioneers of surfing in Ireland, hailing from the north and a subject in the film. Hi, Davy.
Hiya.
And Kevin, the legendary surfer and surf journalist. I've actually read a lot of your stuff over the years, so I'm very stoked that you're here. He also is subject in the film, and we'll actually hear from you in a couple of clips that we're showing later. So welcome.
Thank you.
And Mike joining us from Ireland. Dr. Mike Cronin is the academic director of Boston College, Ireland, and a renowned expert on Irish history, including sporting history. So I know your perspective will be really valuable here. Welcome. Okay, so Sean, I got to start with you as the filmmaker. Talk to us about the origin story of Keep It a Secret and your personal ties to Ireland and kind of what drew you to telling this story.
Yeah, well, the story, it started out, my curiosity, I am a surfer. Nowhere as good as Davy and Kevin, or have surfed as much as them. I'm trying to catch up. I'm over 50 now. But no, I grew up born in New Jersey, but family all second generation. All my grandparents were born. My strongest ties are to the west coast of Ireland. Had gone there in the 70s, so I had exposure to Ireland at a young age. And when you have experience as a young kid, those memories are more powerful, I think. And my memories of Sligo was the ocean, cold. And as I started just getting into film about 7-8 years ago, first thing as a producer was like, what ideas, and it's one thing I had on like a legal pad was surf Ireland. That was about it at the beginning of it. Was an idea, and I was like, hey, maybe that would be a good scripted story. And then all of a sudden, very early in research, I started to find, oh, well, wait a second, there were surfers in the 60s. And that kind of pulled me from a idea of a scripted idea to really just trying to tell the story of the origin story. And that's kind of how it led me to some of these amazing people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last 4 years, and Davy. And but it really started, my first outreach was with Kevin Cavey, who's a prominent subject. And from there, I just kind of kept hearing names as I went through it. Began the production living in Brooklyn, so that was a little bit of a challenge. So we were using a lot of this Zoom technology to make it possible. And I think the first time I talked to Davy, I just kind of got his number and called him cold out of the blue. And then that's where we connected.
Yeah. So Davy, what was your initial reaction to Sean approaching you, to participate? And I'm curious, like, do younger generations in your family realize that you're this kind of Irish surfing legend and one of the early pioneers in Ireland?
They have a good laugh at it. Like, they see me standing there with that yellow surfboard, this thing like an aircraft carrier on the beach, when I was like, I don't know, 14 or 15, So I think that's pretty funny. They don't know that passive. But like, I got to say that this Sean, he's really done a great journalistic job on this film. It is hard, just coming from the outside looking at it, but he really did he has really captured that ethos of that early stage. And obviously going around the country, going to Tremor and meeting like people like Hugh O'Brien, Moran, Kevin Cavey, the Britons, and Kevin Naughton there. And he went round and he just the interviews, one interview with each group of people, and he synthesized that very early atmosphere that there was in the surfing in Ireland. Then obviously you've got like when I started surfing, the troubles really hadn't started. There was always political problems in Ireland, but I was a teenager, I'd been in California. That's where I first saw surfing, and that's what inspired me to start. And because we'd always gone as kids, like in with wooden plywood belly boards on the beach and stuff like that. That was grand. So we were used to the sea, we were used to waves. But as soon as I saw the surf, like at places like Rincon and Malibu, I went, wow, I'd love to do that. Really love to do that. So when we got back here, that's why we set into it and set into doing it. At that stage, I didn't see anybody else. I didn't know anybody else. But it's funny because the whole thing seemed to, from a very small seed, it's almost like a mass consciousness thing. People seem to start all over the country. And we went to the first Eurosurf Championships, and that's the first time we were meeting the Tremor crowd. Or I'd met Kevin Cavey a few times, and but throughout the country, it just seemed to seed and start to grow as it's done internationally. It's an interesting phenomenon that people who don't even know each other in separate places, separate groups, seem to have this common interest developing in them.
Well, to play on what Davy was saying there, it's funny how surfing has gone from being, when I was young and learning to surf, it was a recipe for a dissolute life, and how it's gained this kind of respectability over the years, this transition. Now it's a completely respectable, acceptable thing to do. And it's gone from being a total, when Davey and I were surfing together on all these unknown spots in Ireland back in the 70s, it was very counterculture, very subculture kind of thing we were a part of, a small solitary group. And then all of a sudden it went to this transition. Ireland's kind of a microcosm of what happened throughout the world with surfing. It went to this very mainstream, respectable social activity, from a counterculture kind of underground little thing we were all doing and being a part of.
Yeah.
Totally. And Davy, you had mentioned Tremor, and Sean, as I understand it, you kind of lucked out because there happened to be a reunion in Tremor that you were able to capture. It was a bit of a lucky break for you, right?
Yeah, it's the exact thing you do not want as a surfer turned out to be fortuitous for me. It was this reunion of one of the first surf competitions in Ireland, Eurosurf Championship. But, as conditions can go, it was flat for 3 days. So actually I got people while they were available for interviews. So none of these guys were going out in the water, but, I got to also tip the hat to Sabine Kreinbuhl, former neighbor in Brooklyn and producer of the film. She gave me the very sage advice. She goes, hey, I was planning to go over there just to do research because a lot of people were coming in for this. And she said, you know what, even though it's research, bring a camera and get good audio. And lo and behold, those would become a lot of the master interviews of the film. And then, you talk about fortuitous moments, like coincidentally very Irish of an Irish film, a second cousin, I think, of Kevin on the call, Hugh O'Brien Moran, walks in very quietly. He's a photographer. Margaret, his wife, is a distinguished photographer. He's like, I understand you're looking for some archive footage. And he proceeds to hand me a drive with about 300 stills on it. So all of a sudden, it's like, not only I have a great interview with Hugh, I have a tremendous leg up on archive. So, but yeah, that first trip to Tremor was huge. But one thing I will say on that trip to Tremor, I met a lot of the surfers who are on the other side of the coin, who are maybe more for the organization. I kept hearing all these names, Davy, Govan, Alan Duke. And I'm like, where? Bo Vance was there from the north, but the rest, I was hearing these names, but they weren't at the reunion. So I'd have to go to them. And that's where I went up to Northern Ireland a few months later. And that was great.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the archive material, because I think that for me is one of the coolest things in this film. It's all of the photographs, the home video footage. You had a lot to sort of cull from, and I'm just wondering if there were any images or video that you're particularly fond of.
Well, I have to say, in the lower corner here, Kevin Naughton, extremely generous. Kevin, maybe you could talk about the video footage that you contributed. Literally, Kevin and I had not even met yet, but I explained the project. He's like, listen, it's still on film, but he said, if you can pick it up, you can digitize it. But yeah, Kevin, you want to talk about some of the footage that you contributed? Then I'll also.
When I lived there in Ireland, I like to tinker around with a Super 8 and before that a regular 8 camera, taking some footage of all the places that we traveled to. And then I'd come home. It was more like a hobby. I put together a little half-hour reel to show to my friends. Here's Ireland, or here's somewhere else. And then so I had the footage. I had stacks of footage from all my old travels, and I'm happy to share them when it comes to Ireland.
Yeah, which is a lot of, everything that you see, a lot of that footage of the film footage was him. And then also just kudos also to Kevin's partner for many years, Craig Peterson, renowned surf photographer, the youngest surf photographer ever for Surfer magazine. To have his stills in the film are about as great I know, like, those have been hugely complimented in the amazing footage.
What makes your documentary so cool, Davey mentioned earlier, is that it, with all you're using the Craig's photos and my footage, we were unwittingly capturing a time in our surfing that will never come again. It will never be repeated. It's come and gone. And that's kind of what documentaries do so well. They give you a little mirror, window into the past. And that's, I think your documentary did a nice job of showing that past, vis-a-vis the old footage I had laying around here and Craig's shots and other stuff you scrapped together.
Yeah, well, so Kevin, you're saying there is something that's kind of irrecoverable about this era in Irish surfing that is captured so beautifully in this film. And I know you've surfed just about everywhere. So I'd love to hear from you, what makes Ireland such a special place to surf? And I'll ask that same question to you as well, Davy.
Well, it's no longer such a special place to surf. Okay, let me say that from the beginning. But back then, It was, I showed up in Ireland. First, I showed up in the early 70s, and that's when I met Hugh O'Brien down in Tremor and those guys. I was on my way to France on a little surf trip. But then I came back in the mid 70s and took a serious look around. That's when I met Davy and the really incipient surf crew. When I say hardcore surf crew, I mean the guys who surfed all year round, not the guys who were just there in the summer when the water was tolerable, but the guys who were going in the winters when the best waves are. That's when the coldest water is. So I became a part of that group, and I just can't believe how fate, put me here at this time and place in the mid 70s to such an untapped surf potential in a country like Ireland. I'd never, in all the travels I'd been around the world, I'd never been to any place quite like Ireland, where there were as good a waves as I'd seen anywhere in all my travels, and there was no one around. I mean, literally no one around. If someone showed up to go surfing with you, you were like, all right, I've got somebody to paddle out with. It was like that, and it was one of those things where I just couldn't believe that it was real almost, that it was happening at that time. And I wanted to just immerse myself in it because it was so special, and the people that you met then, everybody was a very special little group of guys who were in on this great secret that no one else knew. And it just felt I can't describe how it felt to be a part of that. And in retrospect, it's become even more special looking back on it because it's all over. That will never happen again. Like I said earlier, no one surfed then, and now everyone in Ireland surfs. Okay, so that's how it's changed. So that's it.
Yeah, I was reading a surf magazine a few years ago, and there's this young surfer, Irish surfer, and they were talking about the great waves there was in Ireland, the great breaks, and what a fantastic country it was to surf in, And the interview went on like that, and the interviewer said, is there any drawbacks to surfing in Ireland? And he said, yeah, just the sheer misery of it.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, this is a good jumping off point then for us to roll clip 2, where we hear more from you, Kevin, about surfing in Ireland. So Colin, could we cue that up?
We're driving through this little town called Bundoran. I looked out the window and I just saw this perfect A-frame, 8-foot peak breaking. I was gasping, this can't be real. It's an illusion. I screamed at my parents, stop the car. And of course they shut up. We'll get you an ice cream in the next town. No, I want to see the wave. But they kept driving, but it always stuck in me, that image of that wave. And I thought, man, there's waves here. That's a real wave. And there was, of course, not a sinner out. The water was empty. Nobody was surfing around there back then, as far as I knew. The waves there were as good as waves I surfed in California, but there were no crowds. I mean, nobody, not even other surfers. I thought, this must be like stepping back, not to the 50s, but to the 40s in California, before, surfing was really even recognized, before anything. And that's how I felt when I stepped into Ireland.
Yeah, so we know from this film that surfing in Ireland in those days was quite a do-it-yourself operation. And Davy, I think one of my favorite parts in this film is when you talk about your first board and you compare it to like an aircraft carrier, like it was so big, anybody could have climbed on that. And so I'd love to hear from you a little bit, Davy, like when you're thinking back, what did you guys have to do in terms of equipment and clothing to be able to surf in Ireland when the industry didn't really exist?
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's really because my father did a bit of woodwork and he was good at woodwork. So we basically, like, from memory nearly of seeing surfboards in California, constructed this thing about 10 or 11 foot long. And I suppose at that time, the only kind of these images of people surfing in Honolulu, like Duke Kahanahamuku or something like that, just coming in these 2-foot waves. That seemed to be like what surfing was. We hadn't really seen, people riding in the tube and stuff like that. So you take this big yellow board out in Portchurch Strand and come straight in. I didn't see anybody else. I think the first people I saw in Ireland with boards, I was sitting in a car park just outside Portrush with my parents. There's probably about 14 or 15. And this car pulled in with 3 surfboards on the roof. And I was just like completely shocked. Surfboards here? And that turned out to be Kevin Cavey doing one of his original sort of trips around Ireland. So that was the connection then. And that was the first, he was saying like they're going to try and get surfboards in. So I remember that would have been like Easter. The following autumn, coming up to Halloween, he'd got some pop-out boards in from England, from Cornwall. And that was the first time we actually had like a commercial proper surfboard, 10-foot long pop out. But we had no wetsuits, you see, at that stage. And I hadn't actually met anybody else that had a wetsuit or knew anything about it. And both aunts, Martin Lloyd, they showed up at the house one night when I was doing my homework, and they said, we're thinking of going up to surf on the North Coast. And I said, well, like, it's November, the water's really cold. And they said, no, we've got the loan of these divers wetsuits, like 2-piece things, right? They were like straight jackets. It was like and they had these buckles down just above your groin area that was all right for divers, but when you're leaning on a surfboard, these things kind of like dug into you, So we realized this diver's wetsuit thing wasn't going to work out. So then really, I suppose it was both aunts that discovered that you could buy sheets of neoprene. And I think Alan Duke describes it in the film. He says you basically lay on the ground and somebody made a chalk mark around you. We cut the whole thing together and make sure that the wrists are not too tight or that the ankles are too tight, because you'll never get out of the thing. These wetsuits had no lining in them or anything like that, so they were just pure neoprene. So the only way you could actually put them on was by putting talcum powder. You put talcum powder down the legs and the arms, so that you would be able to slide into them, And I remember seeing like Alan Duke. Well, he'd made his ankles a little too tight and his wrists too tight. And on a freezing cold day in Portstewart, he was on his back wriggling, trying to get out of this wetsuit, Yeah. And we did things like leashes and stuff like that, surf leashes and stuff like that. And I got to give both aunts the thing, because like we thought, no, you don't use leashes for surfing. I think Kevin, you said leashes were for dogs,
Yeah.
And Bo developed the surf leash like really from basically first principles in front of us. We just ignored it, of course. This is a crazy idea, But he actually developed the surf leash right through. Then about 2 years later in France, we were watching some Californian guys surfing. We were thinking, God, these lucky guys, they don't lose their boards. And when they came in, that was the first time we'd seen surf leashes. And we thought, that's what Bo was talking about 3 years ago. So getting the equipment was a problem. And I always remember, like, whenever Kevin came over, and Kevin was studying literature at Trinity, and he was going back to California. There was like a queue, wasn't there, Kevin, to get your wetsuit?
Oh my God, I'd come back with a suitcase full of wetsuits, the latest in technology.
Yeah, an O'Neill wetsuit, that was just it. Like, yeah, maybe I was third or fourth in the queue. I was really disappointed.
Oh.
And then the surfboards, the Gary Linden surfboard, Gary Linden.
Oh yeah, Bruce Jones and Gary Linden. You got that. I wish I could get that balsa board back off you.
Oh, no.
From Linden, please. Let me buy it back, please.
No, that's priceless. I'll let you surf on it if you come over.
Okay, I'll come over just for that.
Professor Mike, so I know you grew up in the UK, and I'm just curious, like, as a kid, were you aware of surfing in Ireland or Scotland, not so far away? I'm curious to kind of hear what role surfing, which I think we consider quite American, in the collective imagination, had, I guess, within British popular culture, especially among young people. Just curious if it was something you knew about when you were growing up.
I think what Davy was saying at the beginning, I think it's a very kind of Californian idea. I grew up in the Midlands of England, so I was literally the furthest point in England you can get from the sea. But we would have gone down to Cornwall in the 70s, where people were surfing. Cornwall definitely Newquay definitely had a surf industry. Ireland, I think the first time I came over to Ireland in the 80s, the idea of surfing. I think the one thing that comes through in the film is and somebody mentioned it earlier, it's this idea that Irish surfing speaks to a counterculture, and I think surfing did anyway. But I think in Ireland you've got two or three things going on. You've got to remember that this is a country that at this point is slipping into a sectarian conflict. It's also a country that's just totally economically stagnating. It's a country that is still kind of emigrating 20,000 people a year. It's not a place for young people. So in the idea that we got in from the 70s into the 80s, a kind of the advancement of a leisure culture, a sports culture, things like surfing that involve spending a few dollars on a board or a suit once they're commercially available. That just doesn't work in an Irish context. Ireland, the Republic as well, deeply conservative, deeply Catholic. Long-haired guys with surfboards. I'm sure Davy and Kevin would agree with you. They stand out like a sore thumb in 60s, 70s Ireland. This is not normal. So yeah, I think Ireland offers a kind of very, very strange context that it's the cold, it's the climate, it's lots of things work against it as a natural thing to do. But I think actually the state of the country is difficult. This takes a real leap of the imagination, not like going down to Newquay or going down to somewhere in California where you're seeing 100 other people doing this. That looks fun, I'll join in. You've got to, like David did, stand there and figure it out yourself. That's where pioneers come from. And that's the one thing I thought Sean did brilliant in the film, was just that notion of what you're talking about when you look at the pioneer group. It's literally one picture of 6-8 men. But just how tiny this scene is, from which begets 30, 40 years development of surfing in Ireland, and Ireland as a surf venue is quite incredible. It's not 100 people, it's 5 and 6 and 7. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with all that.
Yeah, and we know, it is I think on the whole, tonally a light film, but there is some tension, between the different camps of Irish surfers. And Kevin, I think you framed these opposing ideas quite nicely in a clip we have. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and show that, and then we'll talk a little bit about this aspect of the film. So could we play clip 3, please?
The surf culture in Ireland, even though it was one big happy family, I realized early on that there were 2 distinct groups of surfers in Ireland. There was the very, I would call them like the guys in the blue blazers, who were like, we're going to make surfing part of mainstream, and we're going to have contests, and we're all going to show up in ties and wave to the media and all that. And that was good. But then there was the other crew who were sort of represented the renegade element that surfing, was about as well. And those were more like the guys from the north, Alan and Davy and Martin Lloyd and a few others, who kind of represented a counterculture in a good way, but it was definitely counterculture, They were doing something that was unique, and they knew it was unique.
Yeah, so Sean, you're an avid surfer yourself. And so when you went back and are and doing your research and interviewing folks and putting this together, I mean, did that tension between those 2 camps surprise you?
Well, it was, it was early in the proceedings, I think, as we could see, Kevin was very great about just drawing a really nice distinction. And I think when Jay Cooper, the editor, and I looked at it, it's like, okay, that because Kevin is a writer and a surfer, which is he's great at articulating points. And so we just were like, but, it was obvious early, like, when I went to that, the reunion in Tremor, there was a camp that was there, celebrating the event of the contest, you could say commercialization, of the sport. And then you were hearing other names who weren't there. So that kind of drew it to me, that there was, Kevin, and in each of my discussions with the subjects, it is, that was kind of the primary story I tried to, tell, is like, that's a recurring theme in surfing in general. It's like, you should have been here yesterday. Kevin Naughton, Kevin also, for those who don't know Kevin was like, kind of really, he and Craig Peterson, I was on a Reddit blog yesterday, and like, he's still getting accolades for really developing surf journalism, to have his perspective, a guy who was also at Dublin at that time with real world perspective, when he had done it, it was really, there weren't many people who had traveled that Africa, South America, Central America, to really have that perspective. So I think it was really good to, share those 2 worlds, because as Kevin said, it's like, the desire of every surfer is to kind of get to a spot where it's hopefully not too crowded and before it gets too well known. And I think the crew in Ireland, both sides, the Belfast crew and the crew from Dublin, I think they both realized how great it was. It just, what do you do with a jewel that valuable? Do you kind of, that's I think the tension I came across.
Well, I think what you got across there, Sean, and in the film, is that there's good people on both sides for starters, but there's a real basic, strong philosophical difference between the crew that represented by Kevin Cavey and the film, and that where it's like, hey, we have a great thing here. Let's all come and share in the crack. Let's all go out and surf together and catch a wave together and ride it together. And I mean, that's one way of looking at it and tell the world. Then there was the philosophical viewpoint from people like Davy and Alan and myself and some others were like, surfing is a very solitary thing, activity, and it's just you and the wave. And you don't really want to announce it to the world. You know, you just want to share it with some close friends or even just by, you know, it's a solitary pursuit. And there's where the philosophical line is drawn between those people. You know, that's where the difference lies.
Yeah, well, you know, given the tension that you're talking about at that time in this film, and you know, the attempts to organize surfing as a sport, I'm curious to hear, Kevin, what you make of surfing becoming an Olympic sport finally in 2020. I'm sure this is a topic probably have been asked a lot about but
I should just start by saying, you know, people like Davy and myself, we're the dinosaurs. We're the comet of commercialization is making us an extinct species. Okay, so that's how I view the Olympics and all the other commercialization of surfing that's made it, you know, a multi-billion-dollar industry and so mainstream and all that. It goes against everything that I grew up believing and thinking, and I realize I am a relic of the past because of that, as is Davy, I'm sure. And but that's the way it is. You know, we represent a different thought and time frame, and I have no resentment against all the things that have happened in surfing. And it's Olympic sport. It's as mainstream as any sport out there. And fair play, things change. That's okay. But there is a kind of a wistfulness to it back in the days when it was, like Mike said earlier, a counterculture thing. It really was. And when you lose that, you kind of lose a certain je ne sais quoi. I don't know. It's hard to describe what you lose, but you do lose something when it gets to be as mainstream as an Olympic sport. What do you think, Davey?
Yeah, I mean, like to go back to the really early stuff, like, I mean, there wasn't really any bad feeling or any kind of serious animosity between, you know, the organizers and the rest of us, really. And, you know, the surf competitions, the early surf competitions, they really were like parties, really. They were just gatherings of the small Irish community there together. So it was complete exchange of information. They're really good fun. I mean, the inter-county stuff in Rossnoila, organized by Vinnie Britton, and you know, they were great gathering things, and they were basically very joyous occasions. And there was nobody was sort of like against the organizers or anything like that. I mean, we tried to have a surf club, like because they you know, the Kevin Cavey, they were setting up the surf clubs around Ireland and the Cork ones and everything like that. And then they were going to set up an Irish Surfing Association. And we'd had a surf club up here, like a small thing, and it was called the Eurosurf Surf Club. But we made a big mistake, and we made Alan Duke the chairperson of it, right? After Alan was made the chairperson, there wasn't any other meetings called.
Yeah.
Club, right? But we had to go to this meeting down in Dublin, where all the surf clubs of Ireland, these 5 or 6 surf clubs, and most of these people were kind of businessmen. They were hotel owners and stuff like that, and we weren't really like that, you know. And everybody had to sort of put money into this Irish Surfing Association, and they were writing out checks and putting money in and stuff like that. And Alan and I were sitting there, we're thinking, like, if we agree to this, we're going to have to go back to Portrush and get £5 off people like Martin Lloyd, you know, and Bo Vance and stuff like that. And they're going to say, no, they're going to get the money off them. So when it came round to us, like, there was a kind of tension, and Alan is quite quietly spoken, you know. And he said to Roger Steadman, he says, Roger, actually, we don't have a club. There's a deathly silence, you know. So we were never able to incorporate ourselves into the Irish Surfing Association. But I must say that the competitions and stuff, they were good fun, and the atmosphere was terrific at them. I mean,
yeah, it was great crack.
It was never a dog eat dog thing, you know. I mean, everybody knew that Alan Duke was the best surfer in Ireland. There was no question about that, you know. Lots of other fine surfers like Hugh O'Brien Moran and stuff like that. And I always say the story about, like, they had a Irish Surfing Championships in Lahinch, and Alan got knocked out I don't know why I got knocked out in some early round, which left the whole thing open. Anybody could win this thing now, you know. The competition went on. It came to the final. I think Hugh Brandmoran was first. I was second. We're all standing there on the podium getting their pictures taken for the Limerick leader or something like that. And Hugh Brand turns around to me and he hands me the thing. He says, "This goes to the man who won this thing." You know, that's how seriously anybody took the thing. It was fun.
Yeah.
You know, we were all enjoying.
It was a great tribal gathering.
Yeah, tribal gathering.
It was a surf tribe back in the 70s, and that's how
the north-south thing didn't come into it at all. I mean, most of the ones down the west coast of Ireland, I mean, what was going on out in the north might have been Vietnam or something like that. I mean, they were never up there. They didn't blame them either. Like, you know, they didn't go up there for their holidays. The only surfers really who came into the north at that time would have been the Britons, Brian Britton and Connor Britton, and who's sadly not with us now, and Willie Britton, you know. So they because they were in Donegal, it was quite handy. They would have come across and surfed around Portrush. We spent a lot of time, obviously, down in Donegal surfing as well too, in Rossnoila.
So we got a question from Tanya, who's joining us. Hi, Tanya, who's wondering, were there any women surfing in Ireland around the 70s or around the time of its growth and popularity? So Davy and Sean and Kevin, maybe you guys could all speak to that from your experience.
Didn't Hugh's wife surf a bit, Margaret? Or I think she surfed back then, but there might have been, I mean, you count them on one hand with a couple of fingers missing. You know, that's how many surfed. Really, we never ran across women surfers.
What's it like today? Are there quite a few?
Well, I'll just say like Viv Evans, you know, like Harry Evans was like one of the one of the Dublin crew. Viv actually was going to try to join the call today. She was, again, but younger. She was probably that, you know, she was, I think when these guys were kind of surfing 13, 14. But it was a much smaller crew back then. But yeah, Viv actually, and Harry's story is kind of in the film. Yeah, I'll let those folks who haven't seen it, you know, check out Viv's part, because it's a good, you know, moment of her, what surfing meant to her was pretty significant.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is show our fourth and final clip, which talks about the Troubles, which is obviously a big part of this story. And then we can segue into that area of the conversation. So Colin, could we roll clip 4, please?
Northern Ireland was beginning to be torn apart by the conflict known as the Troubles.
The war was so sectarian. It was Protestant against Catholic. It was the IRA against the UVF. It was the Unionists against the Sinn Féiners. It was the British against the Irish.
Dawn over Belfast today showed a grim scene. Buildings scarred by fire, thousands of pounds worth of damage caused, and of course the tragic loss of life.
The Troubles conflict stems from a very long history of English conquest of Ireland. After many failed rebellions by the Irish people, the rebellion of 1921 would lead to the formation of the Republic of Ireland. But the imperfect treaty of 1921 would divide the island between Northern Ireland, under English control, and the Republic of Ireland.
Professor Mike, I'm gonna go to you for this, given your area of expertise. Could you give us a little bit of a sketch of what would have been happening politically in the 70s, especially in Northern Ireland with the Troubles?
I mean, the Troubles, as Sean covers in the films, they have their origins in a civil rights campaign where Catholics are looking for better representation within Northern Irish society, where they've basically been discriminated against since the 1920s. Because there's no kind of governmental response to that, there's a push against it. The problem is that civil rights descends between 1968 and 1970 into violence. So you have communal rioting. 1969, you have the introduction of British troops. You have the rise of the reorganization of the IRA. You have paramilitaries introduced a problem. And really, by the end of 1970, we're kind of bedded down into a conflict that will last for 30 years. That is a huge dislocation. I mean, Northern Ireland is a very small place, it's a small population. How you run normal life in that situation is a challenge. So you see 68, 69, 70 and 71, sports events start suffering. Teams, if they're identified as Protestants, won't travel to Catholic areas and vice versa. You see that happening in soccer, you see it happening in rugby. Irish Gaelic games are more of a Catholic game, but their clubhouses are burnt down by loyalist paramilitaries. 1972, particularly, there should have been the Irish rugby team in Dublin, so not the North, down in Dublin, should have been playing Scotland and then Wales. And the Scots and the Welsh both refused to travel to Dublin to fulfil the fixture. And that's kind of symbolic of how bad 1972 is. So sport kind of really does suffer. In Northern Ireland, sport's always been about separate spaces. And again, that's one thing that comes through very strongly in the film, is how surfing is something that fits into this counterculture, the lifestyle choice, doesn't come with the usual baggage. Are you Protestant? Are you Catholic? No, we're here to surf. It's not a relevant question. Whereas the traditions of a lot of the team sports in Northern Ireland, they've been wedded to one identity or the other. So surfing kind of hits that beautiful sweet spot where you have these people who are really kind of into the idea of what they're doing. They're expressing not just a counterculture in that kind of Californian kind of dreaming great cars, VW campers type idea, but they're also challenging the very kind of sense of what Irish society is about in terms of religious division and saying, not relevant, we're going surfing. And that kind of, they're almost sort of stepping outside that room that the maelstrom island gets caught up in. I think Davy makes another good point as well, is that when you start thinking about the European Championship and Le Hinch, I think David said, the North could have been Vietnam. You've really got to understand that the North goes off in flames. Unless you're on the border next to the North, if you're in Dublin or you're in Le Hinch or you're in West Cork, it's a million miles away. It has little or no impact on your life. So that idea that the people outside of kind of David's crew who are kind of working in the North, or people in Donegal, the rest of them are just getting on with their surfing, and the trouble has a limited impact.
And Sean, as an American filmmaker telling this part of the story, I'm curious, did you feel any pressure to kind of get it right in the telling? And was there anything you learned in your research that surprised you?
Yeah, that would be understating it a bit. It's like, here's a guy from New Jersey of Irish American roots going to talk about the troubles. It was probably, quite frankly, just to be transparent, the most harrowing moment of when they had Belfast screening, because it was like, and when the Belfast Telegraph wrote up an article on it, when they said, hey, this actually got it right. I don't give myself credit. What I did make an early decision on was like, I didn't want the film to be survey. I didn't want to be like from 60 to now, the Cliffs of Moher and Mullaghmore, like 50 years of surfing in Ireland. I'm personally interested in origin stories, and the years that I was going to focus in on, was we were starting to, through interviews with Davy and the rest, was 68 to 72. And if I am going to cover that moment in surf history, it would be a mistake of a huge omission to not acknowledge that. And the way I kind of thought of it, I had to give some historical context, because there's a lot of people who are watching the film who don't know what the troubles are. So I had to give that 2 minutes of context. But then I really tried to step out. I think I have my voice doing narration for about a minute. And then it's right to, as Mike just said, I wanted the perspective of the 18 to 22-year-olds, which was really Davy, Martin, Bo, a little older, who were living through it. And then, the Britons on the other side in the South, and let them do it. But I do think, one of the beautiful things that came out of it was, they didn't know these interviews. They didn't see them together until the end. And you have them saying the exact same thing in terms of, I think Willie Britton and Kevin Naughton finished each other's sentences. There was no discrimination between, where you were. It was how good you surfed in the water was who you are. And to Mike's point, this sport didn't have any baggage of, historical context as maybe, hey, a Gaelic football or something else would. So yeah, it was definitely one of the things that I, and obviously it's not the focus of the film. The focus is the two camps, but that was kind of what I was thinking about when I was trying to do it.
Well, you referenced the Belfast premiere, which I can't even imagine what that would have been like to finally share it, with the world, something that you had been working on for, I think, years at that point. Could you talk a little bit about, what that premiere screening and also in Portrush, what those events were like, and then also generally what reception to keep it a secret has been like?
Well, it was I think the way I kind of sat there, and had some emotional support from some friends who came up. My friend Bill Donahue came up from Dublin with me and sat with me in it. I do have a beef with Kenneth Branagh releasing Belfast, the film, that same week. Did he have to wait for that festival to kind of take my thunder? So I hope Kenneth Branagh is not one of our 24, but Kenneth, I do want that meeting with you. So that was the big one. But I did, that first, there was relief after it because the reception I was very humbled by it, but it was very much audience within audience. I was also very honored that Davy, Martin, Bo Vance, came out to the premiere. They made the trip down to and it was, hey, an audience within an audience. The other kind of funny moment was like Bo Vance, the second the lights came up, got up and marched out. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll take, I guess 2 of 3 were still in their seats and didn't march out. Luckily, he was just going to catch a taxi because he had to get a taxi to get home. But no, I think that, and after we premiered in Belfast, and I was very happy with and relieved after the reception. The next night we went to the theater, which Davy and his Francis, his partner, run up in Portrush, which was a surf crowd. And then to get that reaction from a very different film festival crowd to a surf crowd, that was right before we went to Doc NYC, which is the American premiere. And I was like, okay, well, if it goes nowhere, I'll always have Belfast and Portrush. So it was great. And the Portrush screening was still a really special day because Davey was there. He can articulate it.
Yeah, I mean, it did have a wide appeal. Like, because we do deal with cinema and stuff like that, we're seeing how many people are interested in a film. And I knew Sean was coming over for the premiere, and we've gone to films in Belfast, the Belfast Film Festival and stuff like that, and seen really good films with small audiences, right? So I thought, God, this guy Sean's coming over from New York, and God, there might not be that many people at the show and like that there, right? And then we started to see the bookings, like the whole place got booked out. And a lot of the original surfers in Ireland, friends, they couldn't get in. They were all out in the foyer, what was it like, So then he said, they decided to do a charity thing for this surf thing called the Surf Project, which deals with young people or people with difficulties, all types of difficulties. And it's like a therapy and surfing and stuff like that. So they said, look, at any chance of doing a charity gig the following night, because Sean wasn't going back till Wednesday to New York. And he said, yeah, we'll show it up in Portrush. And like, once again, we can see the bookings coming in. Next thing, like the cinema holds 200. It just went right through, right up to the 200 like that there. Okay, that's a surf field, right? About 2 months later, I was walking into a football match up in Coleraine, and this guy comes up and he says, oh, the last time I saw you were up in the silver screen. And I said, well, where was that? He said, in the Queen's Film Theatre in Belfast. I assumed the guy was a surfer, young guy in his early 20s. And I said, well, yeah, did you enjoy it? He said, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I said, you surf yourself? He said, no. So people enjoy the film, even if you don't surf. You've really got something there, Sean, in terms of that. I think, to use Kevin's thing, je ne sais quoi about it. I don't know. But it seems to have a good wide appeal.
Totally.
We actually we've shown it 3 times. I've seen it. We saw the QFT sold out, and in the Portrush Film Theatre sold out, and then we did a 3rd one, didn't we?
Yeah, a year later.
Yeah, as part of a Swale Festival, and again, people nothing to do with surfing. They really enjoyed the film. It's just a very enjoyable film, even if you surf or not.
Yeah, and I want to get to Sabrina's questions because I know she posted this in the chat a little while ago. Sabrina wants to know, what are your favorite coastlines to surf in Ireland? And she's also wondering if any shorelines have changed appreciably for surfers since those early days that are captured in this film.
Well, you mean, one of my favorite places to surf really was going to County Clare to surf. And you were getting, when you know, like when I would have been like maybe 18, 19, and the troubles were really kicking off up in the north, and there was a lot of hassle, like just driving around, you were getting searched all the time. As soon as you got over the border and into Donegal, it's just a completely different atmosphere. You drive along, like constantly in the north, you'd be stopped, spot checks, you'd be out of the vehicle would be searched, you'd be quizzed up and down, you know. So when you got over the border, that sense of freedom as you drove down through Sligo and Connemara, and I used to get down to County Clare. It was like heaven being in County Clare during the summer, and the cultural difference as well too. I mean, it was just so culturally enriching because, like coming again from the north, okay, there's that culture in the north, but it wasn't something that I was really experiencing. But through the surfers in County Clare that I was running into, I was being exposed to traditional music, you know, the Keeleys, all that cultural stuff like that there, and that was a fascinating aspect of being down there during during those spells that I spent in County Clare. And it's, you know, got nice warm water, a lot warmer than Portrush, and it's a very pleasant county to be in.
You know, it just so happened, like what Davy's saying there, for serendipitous coincidence that where some of the best surf in Ireland is also kind of the heart of the traditional music scene down in County Clare. You go around Doolin and Enniscrone and all those, I mean, Lahinch and all those places. It's great surf and it's a vibrant music scene. So that's a good stretch. And then also that stretch from Ballina to Sligo on the north coast of Mayo, got to be one of the most wave-rich places in the world. And then from Sligo all the way up to Bundoran to Donegal, actually to Donegal town is another just incredibly wave-rich stretch of coastline that is rare to see anywhere else you go in the world. So many spots under so many different conditions, breaking good. So it's a very unique kind of setup, but it's there.
Yeah, like Kevin says, that section of the north coast of Sligo and Mayo really is exceptional, you know, and stuff like that. And I mean, again, you're talking about pioneers and stuff, and like there was like people like Grant Robinson and Davy Pearce, who's unfortunately not with us anymore, and Rocky Allen. They would have gone down all winter down there at Eastgate, the three of them surfing at Eastgate. We were getting all our information about the quality of the surf at Eastgate from those three because they went down every weekend all through the winter. There was nobody else around. And it was through them that really the place was getting discovered.
Yeah, I was staying with them at caravans. We had caravans parked right at Eastgate at the right. And that's where we all stayed together. And oh my God, special time. You know, like I said, if someone else showed up to surf, you think, great, I've got somebody to surf with. That's how different it was then as opposed to now.
Yeah, that's so different. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm glad, Kevin, you also made the comment about the music connection, because on world.com, on our Keep It a Secret webpage, there actually is a Spotify playlist that I think, Sean, you curated, and it's killer. It's excellent. So please, everyone, go check that out. You know, I know we only have a few minutes here, but I am curious, and we've kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but there have been quite a lot of surfing films, obviously, throughout the years. And because of my work acquiring films for World Channel, I kind of have my eyes a lot on the festival circuit. And even now, I think there's one documentary about China's first Olympic surf team that's making the rounds. There's another film called Wade in the Water about, I think, the overlooked surfing histories in Africa. So, Kevin, as a surfer and a surf journalist, I'm wondering what you make of the enduring interest in surfing, even among non-surfers, because as we've said, that's been a big audience for this film.
That's an interesting phenomena that was not around. If you had, back when Dave and I were surfing together there in the 70s, if anyone said to us, you know, what do you think of global surf tourism? We would have looked at them like, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? And that's what surfing, how it's changed over the decades. And that's, you know, the global surf tourism came into the lexicon probably about 20 or so years ago, and it's just exploded from then. And whereas before it was just a handful of countries, there was like a loose network of surf countries in the 70s, if you're Australia or Ireland wasn't one of them, needless to say, or America or Hawaii or South Africa. And then now it's a whole global thing. It's you literally anywhere in the world where there's a coastline and there's waves, there are going to be surfers. So this whole phenomena of global surf tourism took off. And that's how it's become a global surf culture now. And there's a lot of healthy things about that, a lot of good things to say about it. There's a lot of drawbacks too, but that's another topic for another story situation.
So Sean, I got to ask, what's next for Keep It a Secret? I think you mentioned this on your recent PBS Hawaii event, so I don't feel like I'm saying anything that's secret, but I hear you're working maybe on a scripted adaptation of this story.
Yeah, so I haven't contacted Davy and Kevin Naughton's talent agents yet, but no, I have actually been approached for potentially developing some other opportunities around this moment in time, because it is so special. Maybe talking to Kevin and Davy, getting them on the hook for Keep It a Secret too, potentially. The untold stories of part 1, which there are plenty. Yeah, I'm actually, but yeah, short term is number 1, get it released in Ireland, which I hope to be sharing an update in the next few weeks for Irish release in early summer, which is great. And then worldwide too. But yeah, working on, yeah, there is, but in seriousness, I have been approached, for production company about maybe potentially an adaptation of it, which I'm stoked about. And then, yeah, then I'm kicking around a few other ideas, potentially back to Ireland for another production, and another doc idea kind of kicking around. And Kevin actually emailed me about maybe a Christmas story. So Kevin, let's get that on the record.
Okay, it's coming. Okay.
And yeah, and then there's, I think, some other festivals. I'm going to be actually in Kevin's neck of the wood, Dana Point Film Festival in May are going to be screening the film. So yeah, I'm super stoked, and just, yeah, I want to say thank you. I couldn't be happier, Devin. Thank you for championing the film and the World Channel, and having it on PBS. I couldn't be happier.
Sean, it's totally been our pleasure. And Davy, Professor Mike, Sean, Kevin, thank you guys so much for joining us today. This has been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. I've seen the film twice, and we'll probably see it a few more times, because every time I sort of pick up on something that I missed on the first viewing. So thank you guys very much. And I had mentioned before, you can check out worldchannel.com to read more about Keep It a Secret. You can watch it on our channel as well, and you can access that playlist that I mentioned. It is available to stream in North America on worldchannel.org, World's YouTube page, and the PBS app. Please be sure to also subscribe to World's YouTube channel for more films and filmmaker interviews. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great weekend.